Japan Station is made possible in part by Patreon support. If you would like to make sure that I can keep bringing you more content like this, then head on over to japankyo.com/Patreon and sign up for as little as $1 a month. Welcome to Japan Station. I'm Tony Vega. This episode marks the start of year 3 of Japan Station, so yay! Over the past couple years, I've put out 51 episodes, which is not bad for a quote-unquote monthly podcast. I always say Japan Station is a monthly podcast, and I try to put out more episodes whenever I can. Thankfully, I've been able to consistently put out episodes to at least 2 a month and occasionally 3 a month. So, hey, more content for you guys and more interesting people for me to talk to. So we all win. But there's been a lot going on over this past year. I launched a whole other podcast, Ichimon Japan. I also launched another podcast called Japanese Plus Alpha. That one is for the patrons over at japankyo.com/Patreon. And I launched a Patreon. Thank you so much to all the wonderful patrons who have joined over this past year. And I also launched kimitodesigns.com, where I'm selling merch, t-shirts, things like that. A whole lot more designs are coming in the near future. So yeah, it's been a very busy second year, and I'm excited to keep things going. There's plenty more coming for Japan Station, and I've got other ideas brewing in my mind. I'm starting to run short on time, but I'm having a great time doing this. So no worries. Japan Station is not going anywhere. There's plenty more content and plenty other things coming in the near future. All right. So thank you so much to everybody who's discovered the show and who's been listening and who's subscribed and who's helped get the word out. I really, really appreciate it. This show would not be able to grow if it were not for everybody who is listening and sharing it, and all the wonderful guests who shared the show, and all you wonderful people. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. So let's get to my guest today. Today, you're going to get to hear a conversation with someone I was not only excited to talk to, but just really, really honored to get to talk to, because he is a leading figure in the topic that we're going to be discussing. And his name is Dr. Timon Screech. He is a professor of the history of art at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And he is an art historian, but his specialty is mainly in the Edo period, and his knowledge on the subject is just incredible. So his latest book, which is what we're going to be discussing today, is one that I highly, highly recommend. It is called Tokyo Before Tokyo: Power and Magic in the Shogun City of Edo. This is an incredible book, and as you're going to hear Dr. Screech kind of mention, this is in a way a culmination of many, many, many years of work and research, and there's just so much fascinating information in there. At times it reads almost like a detective novel in that he pieces together so many different things like maps and artwork and accounts and just different information sources in order to piece together what it was like to, for example, walk around the red light district of Yoshiwara in Edo, or walk around the Edo Castle, right? What these places were like, places that don't exist anymore, right? But he's able to piece together all this information to give us an idea of what these places were like. And it's just enthralling. It really sucks you in. So if you're at all interested in Japanese history or learning about the history of Tokyo, because Edo is what it was before it became Tokyo. So if you're at all interested in this, I highly recommend this book. The Kindle version appears to be out already, but the physical version of the book, the hardcover, is not coming out until later in November. I believe November 10th. That is what Amazon had listed. So if you want to get the Kindle version, it's out now. I am including, of course, an affiliate link in the show notes, japanstationpodcast.com, or look in your show notes. That will send a tiny, tiny commission over here. It won't cost you anything extra. You can also use japankyo.com/Amazon to go to Amazon and look it up. Again, Tokyo Before Tokyo, Dr. Timon Screech. You can look it up. And you can also do whatever other shopping. Won't cost you anything extra. It'll send a little commission here. Or, of course, you can just get it wherever you get your books. So, yeah, we talk about a whole bunch of stuff, but I won't spoil it. Let's just get into it. Here is my conversation with Dr. Timon Screech.
The next stop is Japan Station. The doors on the right side will open.
But yeah, no, I loved it. So yeah, I was rereading it today too.
Oh well, I'm obviously in Japan now, so until they can
Yeah.
ship me some copies with the post being weird, I don't know. Of course, I saw the
Yeah.
PDF, but I want to have a paper thing in my hand, and
Of course.
various people want
Yeah.
to be given freebies as well. But I've been teaching on Edo period art for 30 years. Actually, next summer will be my 30th year in post, and one of the things I've often talked about is Edo urban planning. And then I wrote a little thing in Japanese several years ago, and various people said, it's a pity it's not in English, but at that point it was kind of old work. I didn't want to revisit it. And then it was, you're obviously in the USA, so the book is coming out from Hawaii. From Chicago, right? But in Britain, the originating press is Reaktion Books, and it was Reaktion that contacted me about a year and a half ago, saying that the Olympics were coming up, the whole world will be thinking about Tokyo. Is there anything I could talk about? And I said, I can't talk about Tokyo. I don't do modern things. But then I remembered this old project, and so thanks to their prompt, I put down a lot of things which I've been teaching for years, and I've got wonderful student feedback over the generations, and I've been gathering up images. So that's basically what it is.
Yeah, no, like I was watching several of your lectures on YouTube, and I've seen, numerous of your other books that you've done, like on Yoshiwara and all that kind of thing. And so it seems like this is like an intersection of so many aspects of what you've been doing for the past 30 years, right?
That's right. And that's in a way why I held back on it, because I've kind of like put everything I know out there now. And this is also part of my feeling that, next summer I'm 60. That's not old in the modern world, but I don't think I'll be teaching forever. So
Sure.
I'm very happy really to sort of pass on this information to people that weren't my students. I've been passing it on to those who have been my students for years already.
Yeah. And I think this is very accessible too. Like, a lot of times you get, scholarly articles that maybe the average person wouldn't necessarily be so interested in. But I think this is very accessible for anybody with an interest in Japan. So I would recommend it to anybody that wants to learn more about Edo, the city itself, right?
Well, thank you. I mean, that was the brief, because it wasn't me writing an academic book. It was Reaktion Press saying, could I do something that would be, obviously it's not going to be an airport book kind of thing, but something that would be fairly approachable for people. And obviously, never mind the Olympics, which of course didn't happen, but there are so many business travelers and foreign residents in Tokyo that just would like to know a little bit more about the city that they're living in. And everyone's first impression of Tokyo is that it has no planning, other than a few major streets imposed in the Meiji period or after the Second World War. Otherwise, it doesn't seem to have any planning. And you mentioned in the email that you sent me, which I read this morning, about Nihonbashi. And there is an important book which was useful to me called Japanese Capitals in Historical Perspective. It's a book of essays by Western scholars. And one of the scholars in that says that, Nihonbashi was created, and yet the shogunate never bothered to, or no, they didn't say bothered, but the shogunate never chose to turn it into a focal center of the city. And I thought that's so wrong. So that's why I kind of began with Nihonbashi, which is the center of Edo, and in a way was the center of Japan, and was the first East Asian city that ever had a center. I mean, the concept of city centers is an entirely Greco-Roman one, as far as I know. So.
Yeah. So, well, then let's just dive right into some of those, things that I mentioned that I wanted to address. But we can start with Nihonbashi. So, I think, like nowadays, people just know it as just another place in like super populated Tokyo. But I mean, the way you lay it out, it seems like that, and what you just said right now, right? Like that was intended as, this bridge that would serve as the city center, right?
The frustrating thing is that there's very few documents from that early period. And earlier times in history and subsequent times, Japanese elites were fantastic diarists and letter writers, and they left commonplace books and all kinds. But the very early 17th century, the warriors have just come off the battlefield, and some of them are still even on the battlefield, and they weren't ones for writing down discussions they were having with advisors. We just don't know. But the records do seem to indicate, it's not 100% clear, but they do seem to indicate that Nihonbashi was built in 1603, which was the date that the shogunate was created. So it has to be linked to that, whether they built Nihonbashi to be their commemoration or whether it's sort of just locked into place in that way. But Nihonbashi became the focal point. And Japanese East Asian cities don't have focal points because the key factor of them is that they're grids. And the grid is a beautiful, perfect, regulated symbol of human control of the earth and the powers. And Edo could never be a grid city because it was a city still at war. So the shogunate wanted something that would make it more than just any old castle town, of which there were dozens around the country, would raise it to the level of something beyond, but could not emulate the expected grid. And at that moment, who should be wandering around Japan in quite large numbers, unusually in Japanese history, large numbers of Europeans, many of them from Naples. I don't know if there were any from Rome, but Seville. And they knew how European cities looked, and it just has to be the case that they had told Japanese people about the way their cities look. When we travel the world, we tell people about where we've come from and show them pictures of it. We also know that the first Japanese embassy that went to Europe, it went through Seville and went all the way to Rome and went to Venice. They returned to Japan with a beautiful, huge, recently published folio book of the cities of Europe. And that's a very famous book in European history. You've got everything in there from Frankfurt and London, and even have colonial cities such as Mexico City's in there. So we know that book was given. We know it came back to Japan. We know the Japanese elite saw it, but no Japanese person wrote down, we modeled Edo on that, because they never would have written that down. But there has to have been exchange of ideas.
Yeah. So another thing you point out about Nihonbashi is the name, right?
Yes.
So of course, I mean, when you look on Wikipedia, just, okay, Japan, it has the kanji for Japan, but you point out another interesting aspect to it that could be very much related, right?
Yes. And again, somebody might take issue with me and say, where's your proof for saying this? But we do know that another part of Edo, you mentioned my Yoshiwara chapter, and you went to the Yoshiwara along an embankment, which similarly, in that case, it's a known fact that it originally was written as 2 tracks. It was wide, and subsequently, for a joke, was written as Japan. So my hypothesis is that the Edo Bridge, similarly, was originally 2-track bridge, and it was a 2-track bridge because the records say that there was a wooden spar in the middle, so that people kept to their respective side, and that made people think what a wide and a magnificent thing it is. So it was a 2-track bridge, which at some point later on, when the documentation begins, gets called the Bridge of Japan. So it's a speculation, but I think it's a perfectly reasonable one.
Yeah. So what was in that area that made that a good place for this kind of city center? Like, I mean, what other important sites were around that area?
Edo had to be drained, right? The castle is on an eminence, which is obviously why the castle was put there. But underneath the castle was all very, very marshy ground. So Edo had to be drained with a series of moats, and it took a long time to build them. And why exactly Nihonbashi was located precisely there, again, we can only speculate on the grounds of what we see now, because nobody said it. But it's exactly east of the castle. So if you stood on Nihonbashi and looked towards the castle, you look pretty much due west. It means the sun rises behind you and illuminates the castle first thing when people begin their daily routine. The sun sets behind the castle. And the westerly east-west vector is important, not only because sun rises in the east, but the west leads you towards Kyoto. The Tokugawa family were originally from a place called Mikawa, near to modern Nagoya. So looking west also looked back to their homeland. And then most fundamentally of all, paradise was always said to be in the west, because when the sun goes down on our world, the sun is going up on the world hereafter. So looking west is to kind of look in a sort of musing, speculative, historical, philosophical kind of way. And I think that's the trajectory that they were aiming for. And you looked that way by looking down one of the canals, which got called the Nihonbashi River, it had no name before, to the castle entrance. But I suppose it could have been anywhere, but the east-west vector must have been one of the things that they were thinking about. And it also meant that if Edo was to be attacked, which it never was, but if Edo was to be attacked, the attack would almost certainly have come from the Kyoto side. So to have Edo's gate on the opposite side, looking towards the west, looking towards the east, probably was for security grounds. And so having Nihonbashi to the east again from that, you look down the river in this kind of glorious vista to the castle gate.
Right. And then you also point out in the book how the bridge ends up becoming kind of the start of the famous Tokaido Road that leads to Kyoto, right? It kind of ends up changing the way people thought about it, because I guess it used to be thought like Kyoto was the beginning point, but now Edo is the beginning point, and it all starts in Nihonbashi.
Yeah. So all roads led to Rome, all roads led to Kyoto, and the road stays the same because Japan is so hilly, as you know. There's not that many places you can build a road. So the Tokaido remained as it had been, but it's just reversed. So what had been the beginning becomes the end, and so Edo is point zero from which all roads go. The Tokaido is the most famous and the most travelled ones, but there were 5 government highways maintained, which all began at Nihonbashi. So it's like a kind of the shogun is collecting into his hands the kind of strings, the ligaments that bind the whole land together. And people who've been to Japan, who such as you are, know very well that the country is so mountainous. I tell students in London that imagine Switzerland, because most of my students probably have been to Switzerland. Imagine Switzerland that goes on. It's not just a little thing in the middle of Europe. Switzerland going from Stockholm to Naples. That's what Japan is. It's almost impossible to hold a country like that together. It falls apart all the time. Little regions go their own ways. They won't pay taxes. The local warlord comes up. So binding Japan together has always been a crucially functional, important thing. And it bound on Kyoto because that's where the emperor was. But now it binds on Edo.
So I do want to go a bit deeper into Edo Castle, and we may just end up naturally going into that aspect of the book. But I want to first start by asking you, like, what. So obviously, with all the years of experience that you have, teaching and researching this, it seems like you already had a lot of the pieces, right, that you could kind of piece together. You knew that in order to find out more about this, you had to go to this resource and this thing. But like, what was it? How do you get an idea of like the way the city is laid out? Like, are there maps, and what are some of the challenges that come with these maps? Like, were they good? Were they reliable sources?
Of course, the Edo period is quite long, so things are very different in 1603 from they were in 1868, and map making improves simply in terms of trigonometry and things, but also the shogunate became less apprehensive about invasions and insurrections. And so initially they're very loath to let information about the way the city looks leak out to a potential adversary. But as time goes by, they're less concerned about that. So by the 19th century, you get meticulous maps, right, which are, by no means any worse than you would get coming out of the USA or, anywhere at that time. They have the means to do them. And so initially, map making may have not had the skills, but also they didn't want maps to be made available to people. And what you frequently find is little pockets of Edo are depicted so that somebody who lives in an area can know where the things are around them, but there's no overarching view that would allow some kind of controlling vision to possess the city visually. And another thing which slightly finds interesting to outside viewers is that things of the greatest importance are omitted from the map. So the Shogun's castle, for example, is just a blank in the center. Nobody should know it. And there's a very nice case. I didn't put it in the book, I wasn't able to, but I wanted to, when such a map is taken to Europe and a European map maker sees it and thinks that's so strange to have a blank in the middle of a map. They knew it was the Shogun's castle, so they depicted a kind of Versailles, which they assumed is what the Shogun might live in. That's quite a well-known map to be published a few times. But anyway, so in other words, that today we think of the whole point of a map is to make information available unproblematically and objectively to anyone who picks up the map. But there are other periods in history where maps aren't open in that way. They also contain and preclude people understanding things. There was no map from the setting up of the Edo period that I could look at and figure it out. But the whole idea of a maps, of course, is also rather our way. when we go to a new city, the first thing we do is we look on a map, or we nowadays download one. And they may well have thought the best way to conceptualize a new city was not to look at it on a map, but to access it in some other way. For example, you would visit the sacred sites. Once you've got the main temples in, you have a kind of net, and then you travel around by boat and things. So they may not have thought the best way to understand the city, in any case, was via a two-dimensional map.
So, like, what are some of the earliest maps then for Edo? When do they start coming up?
There are some from the mid-17th century. We don't always know how widely diffused they were, and they have these blanks.
Right.
They also are not a map to the extent that you could actually use it to go anywhere. You can kind of look at the map and say, "Oh, this is kind of what the city looks like, and that's where that temple is, and that's where that lord lives." But you couldn't walk around the street with such a map and say, "Next right." It wasn't detailed to that level, so it retains the government's ability to control information about its important institutions, while at the same time allowing. Of course, there was huge pride in Edo. Right? Edo became one of the world's biggest cities. People knew it was it was an amazing place. So the government is perfectly willing for people to celebrate the arrival of peace, the kind of ability to travel and move things around that Edo indicates. So that could be shown. And then you get the rise also not of maps but of urban views, which I, of course, used a lot for information in the book. Popular prints showing places around the city. Otherwise, there are... Sorry.
Oh, no, I just love how you would mix, like you had the maps, you had the descriptions, then you would also have like the woodblock prints and try to like piece it all together in order to tell this kind of comprehensive thing, especially about those areas, like you said, the castle, those areas that people weren't supposed to see.
Yes. And there's a lot, as the Edo period goes by, there's a rise of educated bourgeoisie, what they call the merchant class, and they were very proud of the city. They loved the city. They weren't bureaucrats and they weren't government officials. That was restricted to the samurai class, but they were long-term residents of a certain area. They have a huge interest in urban ephemera. So this is moving away from your comment about maps. But one thing when I was studying history as an undergraduate and things, and we were told it was terribly new. They called it the Annales School from France. Terribly new to study things like changing styles of footwear, or how some local farmer understood the calendar, what a woman working the market thought about Easter. These kind of social, historical, low-level things had been largely omitted from the way that Western history is taught. Western history is about battles and kings. But in Japan, because the government kept control of what people could say about the high level, that actually this kind of urban ephemera was very well recorded. So we were much more likely to know at what point people changed their hairstyle from a party on the left to a party on the right than we are to know the name of the shogun's daughter, for example. So there's a vast amount of urban... maybe it's myth. I mean, not everything recorded is correct, but it's what they thought and the way they understood their city. So that was, hugely useful to me. And it's even since I wrote that book, a couple of anthologies in English of these urban, they call them commonplace books. Random jottings is the Japanese word. Some old man goes out or some old woman goes out, sees kids in the street wearing clothes that they didn't have, and they come home and write down. As of this week, I've seen that now little girls wear yellow bows in their hair or something like that. And it's just it's enormous. And then these things often sometimes get turned into literary stories about the change of fads and styles. And
no, it was really interesting. But you also touch on, like, there's specific, like, for example, the folding screens that were for the elite, like those would have some depictions of those areas that the commoners weren't supposed to have access to, right?
Yes. So if you golden screens are for the elite because they are enormous paintings done on gold. So obviously only a wealthy person's going to have them. But by being that, they're allowed to depict things which commoners should not look at. So if you are the kind of person that has an enormous gold screen, you're likely to be the kind of person that's on good terms with the shogun. You may even be his cousin or something. So you can have pictures of anything. But if a common merchant became enormously wealthy, he would not. I mean, there's no rules saying you mustn't. He just would feel it was wrong, and probably the neighbors would say, listen, are you sure you want to stick your neck out in that way? And so it's like, I mean, if we got rich, we probably wouldn't buy some enormous altarpiece and hang it on the house, right? I mean, it just would feel wrong somehow. So I think it's the same sort of thing. There's, you don't have to make rules about everything in pre-modern societies. People know what's right for their station and what's not. So Hokusai or urban printer can make a view of Edo. That's fine. But because the shogun's castle is likely to be visible, you better cover it with a cloud, or show it as taller than anything else, and just maintain the respect for authority. They had a word awe. In U.S. English, I know young people say everything is awesome, but in Edo, awe was a very powerful concept. That you should just lower your gaze and quieten your voice and smarten your clothes when going past such a place. And you certainly shouldn't make a picture of it and take it home. Once you've got a picture of it home, who knows what you're going to do with it? You might step on it, you might spit on it, or even accidentally you might spill something on it, and that would be very wrong.
This is somewhat related, but not from the book. But I was watching one of your lectures, and you mentioned this story of how people weren't supposed to, of course, be able to see the emperor, right? But then you still had to have like art of the emperor, and so there's this one story you tell of like a monk going like back and forth to describe the emperor. Who was that? When was that? Could you describe that?
That's the emperor that ruled at the just into the Edo period. So his name is Go-Mizu no O. It's a long name. And Go-Mizu no O was a very powerful person, and being there at the time when the shogunate is becoming there to stay, he's not entirely happy with it. And the shogun forced Go-Mizu no O, the emperor, to marry the shogun's daughter, which he was horrified by it, marrying a military woman, but he was given so much money he couldn't object. So Go-Mizu no O is a very interesting and problematic character. But anyway, his portrait was made, as you say, and he decided he wanted it made by the greatest artist of the day, which is reasonable for the emperor to have that. But obviously the greatest artist of the day was working for the shogun. He'd already kind of grabbed him. So this artist was brought down from Edo to the palace to depict the emperor. But because he was a person of military class working for the shogun, he could not enter the emperor's presence. That's right. So a monk because monks can meet anyone, they are external to social norms. And this monk anyway was an elite person. He shuttled back and forth between where the emperor was sitting, and in fact, more widely, many Japanese portraits are said to be self-portraits, even though they're not, because the sitter could never have painted themselves that well. But if you said self-portrait, it implies that nobody, inferior person like an artist, did not come into the room and scrutinize you. Visually scrutinizing people was something that was rude. And I don't want to make racist overgeneralizations, but today, Japanese people on the whole, they lower their eyes if they're talking to somebody that's they take to be important.
Sure.
We think politeness is staring somebody in the eye, but in many cultures that's not the right thing to do. But if you don't stare somebody in the eye, how can you make their portrait? So you say, oh no, I did it myself, and then I had a professional artist just brush it up. Or you could say a priest shuttled back and forth. We have no idea whether the anecdote is true, but it allowed the emperor to say, I've had a portrait made accurately by the greatest artist, but at the same time to deny that this military person had come into the room and had stared at him.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned in that same lecture how sometimes they would say, who knows if this was true, but they would say that they traced their own reflection in a mirror, right? Yeah,
that's right. Because if somebody says to them, listen, we know you're not an artist, how can you claim that you painted that? Say, no, well, I just traced it in the mirror. And it's reasonably convincing.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I would have a very hard time doing that.
I mean, a lot of portraits, predominantly portraits, were funerary, so that unless you were descendant of that person, you have no. It's not that you're banned from that. You wouldn't even want I mean, who wants a portrait of somebody else's grandfather? I mean, in Western culture, portraits can be, Rembrandt. It doesn't even matter who's in it. We think it's the soul of the person. The fact of an artist creating a human being is key. But for them, it's like, who is this person? And if it's your grandfather, then you treat it with respect. But if it's not your grandfather, you better give the picture to the person whose grandfather it was. And in Confucian thought, doing funerary rites to somebody who's not your ancestor is very bad. So it's the concept of what a portrait is so different. So almost all Japanese people in the past, there is one important picture of them, which would have been passed down by their family. But, you don't, I mean, in England, you go to a country house and half the paintings in there are portraits of...
Yeah. Huh. So if we could just briefly go back to the topic of Edo Castle.
Right.
So I guess one thing I think I really want people to know is, first of all, the official name wasn't even Edo Castle, right? It wasn't Edo-jo. What was it?
Yeah, Chiyoda-jo. So, and the part of Edo in which the castle was built is still called Chiyoda-ku, right? The Chiyoda ward. So Chi, 1,000, your generations, da, rice field. So it's the castle in the rice fields of 1,000 generations, which is a kind of promise by the shogunate. We will sustain you. After all, there'd been a century of civil war. Civil wars kill lots of people with weapons, but also they kill even more people by starvation because you can't plant and harvest the crops, and soldiers come and steal all the food. So the shogun is saying, we're bringing peace, we will supply, but of course you must tolerate our overarching presence.
Sure.
So that the castle is both a symbol of authority and, to some extent, fear. But the flip side of that is that you will not starve. You will not be subject to wars again. And Japan has had so many civil wars in its history. The Edo period does stand out remarkably in 200 years without a major uprising at all.
So what led them to decide to put it in that area? What was the advantage to putting it there?
If you, never mind a period map, but if you just look at a kind of modern topographical map of the lay of Tokyo, you can see that's the kind of end where the hills are. The north western quadrant of Tokyo is today called Yamanote, in the hills, literally. And the very end of that, so in other words, the last point of the raised ground, which allows you to look out over the sea. Being raised ground, you're not going to be flooded. It's rock, so that you can build a solid building there. That was the last spot. And there already was a castle there before Edo times. In Japan, 16th century Civil War, castles were built pretty much everywhere. And Edo had one. It never was particularly important. So the Tokugawa rebuilt on the same spot. But it was really the only spot that could support a castle in that area.
You also point out how like that area of Edo had the bay, kind of there was protection, right, from like outside, I guess foreigners, boats and that kind of thing, and that led them to move away from Kamakura as well, right? So
Kyoto, of course, is not on the sea, and it may have been built inland for protection. It's easily accessible from the sea, but no ship can come in and bombard Kyoto, and never could, or unload shoulders. So that was the way things had been since ancient times. But by 1580s, we're talking about Portuguese sea power. It's the age of exploration, big ships coming around, and Japan was getting lots of things in, not least lead and gunpowder from overseas countries. So that access to a maritime port was likely to be important, and especially Sakai, which is Osaka's port, became one of the biggest and the most important cities in Japan, although today it's got kind of subsumed into Osaka. Also Nagasaki, well known as a port. But the danger, of ports is that not only your friends bring in trade items, but your enemies bring in soldiers. So Edo has a bay, and potentially you could put guardhouses on either side of the bay and stop any ship from coming in, which is the same in Nagasaki, has a very long bay, and potentially you can police access to it. Also, Edo Bay was quite shallow, so even if a Portuguese or Dutch ship broke through into Edo Bay, it couldn't anything like sail up as far as Edo. The goods were always transshipped to coastal vessels, flat-bottomed ones that would come right into Nihonbashi, as you see in pictures of Nihonbashi with them unloading fish there for the market. There's no kind of tall ships can get in that far. Kamakura had been where the first shogunate, of course, the Tokugawa are the third generation of the Tokugawa are the third dynasty of shoguns, and the first were at Kamakura, and the Tokugawa family claimed to be descendants of that first regime, which is why they said that they were entitled to become shoguns. So likely they would have wanted to build something at Kamakura, but it's too exposed, as would happen when Perry turned up 300 years later, that anyone can sail almost up to Kamakura.
Right.
It's too dangerous. Also, there's a danger of tsunami. So Kamakura actually was obliterated by tsunami in medieval times. But, Edo is pretty much, you get storms and earthquakes, but tsunami couldn't enter the bay.
So what eventually the castle is destroyed. I know there was fire and it was not all at once, right? I think one part gets destroyed by fire, they never rebuild it. But what ends up happening, and then do they just decide like there's no need for it anymore and they just leave it?
Yeah, so it was an enormous castle, right? Obviously. And like castles, it was very visible and very threatening. And then there's a big fire in Edo in 1657. So 9 years before the Great Fire of London, 1657, in which much of the castle was lost, including the keep, 7-story keep. And they decided not to rebuild the keep, and historians have debated why not. Some people have said it was no longer militarily required, that peace was sufficiently embedded, that why build an enormous keep when you don't need it anymore? Other people have said the shogunate already was having financial problems and they couldn't afford to rebuild the keep. And these are the two standard interpretations, and you can take your pick. But my interpretation, which I already discussed in the book called The Shogun's Painted Culture a few years ago, is that visually the shoguns didn't want it. I mean, the castle is so huge and visible. They move from being a government of military force to proposing themselves as a government of moral power. And they say that people don't follow us because we'll kill them if they don't follow us. People follow us because they know we're good. And although the regime always remained military with swords and military titles, they moved to a rhetoric of rule by morality. And so this enormous visible castle keep, they can say to themselves, it's gone because we now know you love us. And since we know the people love us, we don't need to police them in this way anymore. So it's projected as a very positive development. And then the castle, pretty much as rebuilt in 1660 about, remained intact. It had minor fires, but nothing huge was lost until into the 19th century when there were two significant fires. But the good thing about that is that between the first and the second fires, they made a set of preparatory drawings for the paintings to replace the ones lost in the fire. And the decision was the new castle should be built identically to the old one. So we have a set of paintings made about 1825, replicating the way the castle looked throughout history. And recently, these have all been put on into computer graphics. So now you can kind of walk through Edo Castle with period reproductions of the way that things look. In the case of my book, I decided to use the model of Kyoto Castle, which is also not called Kyoto Castle, but Nijo Castle, because I just thought that travelers to Japan are bound to go to Kyoto and they're bound to go to that. So to allow people to walk through that with my suggestions of what the paintings mean, rather than an elaboration of what Edo Castle was like when nobody's ever going to experience it.
Yeah, I absolutely love that part. I've been to Nijo Castle like multiple times, and it made me want to like read that section again and then immediately go to the castle. So,
well, thank you. And if you haven't been recently, it's worth going again because the existing paintings, which were quite grubby after 300 years, have been removed, and they've gone to a museum, and the replicas have been put in place.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
it's brilliant golden color again, although it's not the originals, but it's pretty much how the originals look.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I'm looking forward to visiting again. So
Yeah, too.
There's so many like sites and buildings and temples and places that you mentioned in the book that unfortunately for various reasons are not around anymore. But one thing that just really stood out was so unique, and I had never heard about it, was this giant Buddha statue made of, I guess, like wicker, like what you would make a basket out of, that was like over 40 meters tall. Like I had never heard of this thing, but where was this thing? Like how long did it last? Could you explain?
Yeah. So just to fill in the background to that, Edo Castle is kind of in the middle, and Ueno and Asakusa, the big temple district, which is still there today, is in the northeast. And the northeast, they called it the Demon's Gate, and magically that's where danger comes in from. So you must always have temples there. But there's also the Demon's Rear Gate, the other side in the southwest of the city. So a second conglomeration of temples were put there, which is nowadays Shinagawa. And at the time, it was right on the water. So this Buddha you mentioned looked out over to sea, but now there's been so much reclaimed land, it's all lost, and because the railways went through there, so most of those old temples, unlike the ones in the northeast, the ones in the southwest have almost all disappeared. But the one where this basket Buddha was erected was an important Zen temple, very large grounds and well known. And people had said, what a pity Edo doesn't have a great Buddha. Nara has one, and Kyoto has one, and Kyoto doesn't have one anymore, but it had one then, and Nara and Kyoto and Kamakura have them, so let's put one up. But there was no funding, and so somebody, it's a kind of off their own bat, I think, because it was put up very quickly. And, of course, everyone went to see it, and the local magistrate said this is dangerous to have so many people on the roads, and so he forced it to be pulled down. I think it only lasted for a couple of months. Yeah. And sadly, not many pictures were made of it, but there are a couple of stories relating to it. And in the book, I think I included one image. People took a boat across the other side of the bay and looked back through telescopes to see the Buddha rising above the clouds. But it also reminds us that Edo at this time was a very religious city. I mean, today, Japanese people are amongst the world's least believing. Ask Japanese people in statistics, they hardly anyone says they believe in anything. But that wasn't the case in the 18th and 19th century. I don't know if your listeners have been to places like Myanmar, where every third person on the street is a monk. And it was like that too, so that putting your effort and money into something associated with a Buddhist temple and the Buddhist rite would have been what wealthy people thought was the right thing to do, and it'll secure happiness in future lives, and it'll make sure that their business succeeds and their children are happy and all those things. If 40 meters, by the way, is almost impossible to believe, right? So
absolutely,
it may be somebody's pulling a fast one. In any case, they weren't there with a tape measure, so who knows?
For American listeners, that's over 130 feet tall. That is just absolutely amazing. So
it's like 7 stories or something. I don't know.
I can only imagine how they, I guess, scaffolding of some kind, and then they weave it all together. I don't know how you would do that.
I mean, probably a wooden frame, like building a pagoda. And they probably didn't expect it to last. So they knew from the start, the first time there's a big storm, it'll probably fall over. And the magistrate said, listen, this is much too dangerous. It'll fall over on somebody's house, or it'll catch fire, and that could be horrendous. But apparently the people who put it up made quite a bit of money out of it. The temple got a lot of funds because people immediately started selling souvenirs, and as always in Japan, you start selling little cookies associated with the place. So the great cookies had a following. So, but it's a little anecdote that's really been forgotten in the history of Edo. I wanted to bring it in because, like you noticed, right?
I love that kind of stuff. Yeah, because that's not the stuff that you normally hear about, but it's such a I don't know, it paints such a picture of just even like the character of the people, right? That they would go to those lengths to do that, assuming this is true. But even if it's not, it was still probably a very large statue that drew in people, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so then I'm curious, given just all the incredible research that you've done and looking into all these different places, of course, many of them we can't visit now, but are there any places in modern day Tokyo that are particularly like that you really, really like, that you enjoy, some of your favorites? Can you share anything with us?
Yes. So a visitor to Tokyo for the first time will almost always go to the northeast temple district that I just mentioned, the Demon's Gate, and there's Asakusa, and there's still many, many wonderful things to see. It's on every guidebook. But a sort of inside a little secret thing, when I have visitors that want to see something a little different from that, I always take them to Meguro. Meguro is near to Shibuya, the one of the big partying areas for young people, and it's an old temple district, and there's 3 or 4 amazing temples all lined up there. Sometimes one has to remember that when Buddhism was persecuted in the 19th century, when Japan opened to the West, a lot of temples relocated, especially if they were in city center areas. They were forced out. So some of the temples that are now in Meguro weren't always there, but some of them were. And 2, which if you have time to tell you, and just tell your listeners if they have a chance to come to Tokyo. And there's one called the Octopus Medicine Buddha. Right? So the Medicine Buddha is one of the. There was a Buddha who lived in India, the Buddha, but there are myriad Buddhas, and one of them is responsible for health of people, bodies, and minds, the Medicine Buddha. And according to ancient legend, a holy monk had gone to study in China, and on the way back he meets a terrible storm, so he threw his precious image of the Medicine Buddha into the sea, at which point the storm stopped and they all arrived safely in Japan. But he was very upset to have lost his icon. And then a octopus crawls onto the beach and returns him his icon. And so there are 2 temples in Japan to the octopus medicine Buddha. One of them is in Kyoto, and the other one is in Meguro in Tokyo. And the actual icon is not the one that's in the temple today. It's not the one that was thrown into the sea, which is a small portable one. The one they have at the temple is a big one. It's only open 1 day per year. I've not yet seen it, but it shows the Buddha seated in the lotus position, held up by the tentacles of
very cool. Wow.
Yes, I've gone to the temple several times. I've got to know the abbot quite well. I've begged him to show me the icon, but it's too early to be seen by secular eyes.
It's always so hard to time those. Like, there's so many of those that I want to see, but it's always tricky.
It's very tricky, and then of course everyone goes at the same moment.
Yes,
and
that's the other thing.
And an icon inside its shrine, it may not be very visible. I mean, it's sort of behind an altar and lots of flowers around it. So, although in a way it's magnificent to see these things still in their proper setting, sometimes you think it'd be nice if it could be brought out and put in a museum glass case so you could actually look at it. Anyway, that's one thing in Meguro. The other thing is that when the Buddha entered into nirvana, well, he went up to the highest heaven. He came back once to this earth, and he came back to the highest point on earth, which was identified as a place in Sri Lanka. And he preached, but since he was extinct, he couldn't talk. So he just twisted in his fingers a lotus flower. And some people happened to be present, and they spontaneously attained enlightenment. And they are called the Arhats, and supposedly 500 of them. So in Meguro, there is a temple of the 500 Arhats with 500 life-size images of these people who heard the Buddha preach.
Wow.
And a life-size Buddha, of course, a life-size Buddha is 5 times the size of one of us, and it was this extraordinary kind of diorama kind of experience of actually being there in this place in Sri Lanka and seeing the Buddha. Now, that temple relocated in the 19th century, and sadly, in order to pay for that, it had to flog off some of the images, so they're not all there today. One of them, interestingly enough, is in Harvard University. So they some of them have gone on to good homes, but one of them is in Detroit, and one of them is in the National Museum of Bosnia. I don't know others. Nobody's ever really been able to trace them. But anyway, that temple, despite the fact it's not all still there, it's definitely worth it. And you can find some pretty interesting little temples around Tokyo, so long as you go there when they're open. The 500 Arhats is always open, so that's fancy.
Huh. I mean, I'm familiar with the name Meguro. I've passed through, but I didn't know those were there. That's, wow. No, thank you. Huh.
Yeah.
Last area I wanted to ask you about, is there anything, especially related to Edo, but any other larger mystery that you've come across that maybe it's impossible to find out, like what the story behind that thing is, or something that you would love to investigate further about Edo that is on your mind but you haven't gotten to yet?
Well, one thing which I'm currently working on is the cult of Tokugawa Ieyasu, right? The first shogun who set this up, died in 1616, and he died near the modern city of Shizuoka, and he was buried there. But then 1 year later, his body was dug up and moved to Nikko. So Nikko is another place that tourists today would always go to, which is the mausoleum of the first shogun. But why did they dig up and move his body?
They didn't cremate him? They just buried him whole, like actual body?
Yeah, so he would have been embalmed. So the body, and obviously digging it up a year later, the whole thing would be completely revolting if it was.
Yeah,
but it was
that's like the worst time. Oh, jeez.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, and he was relocated. So my current study, and I hope this will be a book in 2 or 3 years down the line, about the deification of Tokugawa Ieyasu, and therefore the deification of the whole shogunal entourage. Because, of course, it offset the emperor. The emperor, nobody says it today, of course, anymore, but the emperor was taken throughout history as a kind of god. I mean, God is hard to say if you come from a Judeo-Christian Islamic background, because there's only one, it's almighty. But, of course, Shinto has myriad gods. It's not such a big deal to be a god. But the emperor was the only human one. And but the Tokugawa shoguns are turned also into divinities. So that's a very intricate question. There's many theological points. There's many secrets. There's a whole range of objects which are not normally shown, and I'm trying to little by little pry open the doors to find out more about that. But another thing for your listeners, if they get to Tokyo and they have a day free, Nikko is a day trip. It's a long day trip, but a couple of hours in the train, and then as many hours as you can spare walking around this extraordinary shrine temple compound to the deified first shogun. And it's all been immaculately restored, because he died in 1616. 1617 he moved to Nikko. His body was rebuilt, and then 1637 they rebuilt it. So we are approaching the 400th anniversary, and it's all been amazingly beautifully restored for that.
So is his body, the remains still there? They never cremated him?
Yeah, his body is still there, except the abbot of the original mausoleum in Shizuoka, from which he was removed from a year later, the abbot swears that he still has the body.
Oh, God!
And I've debated this, but everyone else says it's up in Nikko. Of course, the answer to that is, let's open the grave and find it.
But no, they're not going to let you do that, of course, right?
They're not going to let you do that, no. I mean, I personally, I would think that 400 years on, it's okay. But it's not been permitted. If it was permitted, we'd not only find out where he really was, but he might be buried with some interesting objects.
Oh yeah.
We could reconstruct his face, possibly.
Wow.
What was his last meal? I mean, there were many things could have been discovered about him. But maybe one day in the future, and when technology is better than it is today, we'll be able to find all that stuff. Several shogunal graves were opened because one of the main mausolea, not of the first shogun himself, but of other members of the family, was bombed in the Second World War, and the graves were all broken open, and the bones were all analysed there. In fact, one of the later shoguns was buried there, and he had a set of floating world prints, the kind of things one thinks the elite didn't have, and he also had a pocket watch made in London, which
wow.
amused me.
Interesting. So was I guess it was common for the shoguns to not be cremated and to be embalmed and kept in that way.
The elites were always embalmed. I don't know. I should know this, but I honestly don't know the point at which cremation became more common.
Oh, interesting.
In Buddhism, unlike Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, it doesn't really matter if the actual body, there's no notion of a resurrection of the body or anything like that. So it doesn't matter for your body to be gone. There would have been a psychological thing for families dealing with the fact that their parent's body is gone. But that would have been a social expectation, not a secular one. Today, by law, everyone must be cremated, except practicing Muslims are allowed to have burials in Japan, and the emperor is always buried.
Wow, that's very interesting. I didn't know that. Huh.
Yeah. But many regional cities, have their castle, and there would have been the Lord's temple. Probably in those temples, it's certainly the early Edo people would be bodies. Right.
Huh. Well, I am very much looking forward to that research. That sounds fascinating.
Don't hold your breath. It's a little while, but at some point,
I'll have when it comes, and I'll be happy to read it. So.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Of course, I will have all the links for all the books. It's just, like I said, I loved reading it. I think this is a great little, way for people to kind of appreciate the city better, right? Like a lot has changed, but there's so much fascinating history there in that book that I think more people should find out about. So thank you so much.
Thank you for enthusiasm and for writing it. And I hope your listeners will enjoy what they discover between the pages.
Just a reminder, the book is called Tokyo Before Tokyo. Very easy to remember, right? Tokyo Before Tokyo. Link in the show notes. Amazon, blah, 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 japankyo.com/Amazon. Pick it up. Highly recommend it. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to be rereading this book in the near future because it's a really great resource. For Ichimon Japan, for example, we look into a lot of Japanese history-related kind of stuff, and I'm pretty sure that at some point or another, I'm going to be dipping into Tokyo Before Tokyo again to use it as a resource for that. So again, Tokyo Before Tokyo, go pick it up. And Dr. Screech and I were actually discussing a different book after we were done with the interview, but another book just came out that he wrote. It came out in October in the US. Again, all these dates that I'm giving are for the US, so this may vary a little bit depending on, for example, if you're in the UK. But the other book that we were discussing is called The Shogun's Silver Telescope. And this is another really, really interesting one. I didn't get to read this one, but I did watch a lecture that he was doing on this topic. I think I probably watched 2 different lectures that he did on this topic on YouTube. And it's all about the English and how in the very, very early 1600s, like right at the beginning of the Edo period, they were, I think, like trying to establish trade with Japan and kind of move in on them and kind of like take control there for various reasons, including one, which was the fact that they thought Japan was a lot larger than it was. Like if you look at maps of the time, Japan was really, really big. And so they thought like getting a hold of this like market to trade there would be good for, again, various reasons. It's a really interesting thing, and I can't do it justice to try to explain it here. But if you're interested in what we talked about and going deeper and deeper into this rabbit hole of Edo history, again, that's another great book to check out. I will include the link for that one as well. And I will also include maybe a couple of those lectures that I watched in case you want to get a general idea of what this book touches on. That will be in the full version of the show notes at japanstationpodcast.com. If you have any questions or comments, or you want to let me know about any interesting Japan-related projects that you're working on, send me an email to mail@japanstationpodcast.com. Remember to follow on Facebook and Twitter at Japankyo News. And of course, subscribe, rate, review, tell a friend, do all that stuff. All that stuff helps the show keep on growing, and it doesn't cost you anything extra. So, hey, we all win. And of course, thank you to Edo Me for providing the theme song. And that does it for this episode. Make sure to come back on November 15th for the next episode of Japan Station. I will be recording that one tomorrow at 3 a.m. So, come back on November 15th to hear what it sounds like to do an interview at 3 a.m. Actually, I tend to stay up pretty late most days, so that's not too far past my bedtime. Normally, I go to sleep around 2:30 a.m. because, yeah, I do that. I work better at night, so that's just what I do. So anyway, come back November 15th for that. And by the way, if you really enjoyed today's conversation and you enjoy the topic of Edo, I highly recommend that you check out Japan Station episode 27 and episode 11. Both deal with the city of Edo, a little bit of history, and the layout of the city of Edo. For example, episode 27 is with Anna Sherman. She wrote a book about the bells of Edo, all right, the bells of old Tokyo, as she puts it in the title of her book. But it's a great book, by the way, and that episode is really, really fun and interesting too. So again, episode 27, go check that out, japanstationpodcast.com, or look in your RSS feed. And then episode 11 is with Dr. Stephen Hine. He is a former professor of mine. I actually went to Florida, went to his office, and interviewed him in person. We talked a little bit about the layout of the city of Edo, as well as religion and some interesting sites in Edo, and ideas about whether Japanese people are religious or not. That was a really interesting conversation, and I have to say, I miss doing in-person interviews. They're fun. I love getting to talk to people, no matter whether it's in person or over the internet. But there's just something, about getting to see someone and talking to them and, having the equipment there and making sure that it sounds perfect. It's just fun. It's fun for me. So hopefully, we'll be able to do that again someday in the not too distant future. But anyway, yeah, episode 27 and episode 11. If you haven't listened to those yet, go check them out. Go check them out. They're pretty good episodes. Even if, it's me, I guess I'm kind of biased. So anyway, they're there for you to enjoy if you haven't done so yet. Thank you so much for listening. And hey, remember, go find your miniature pony.
Just do it!